Thank you very much et bienvenue ici ce soir. Et puis, je suis très heureuse d'être ici en Ottawa encore. J'étais ici pendant 2002 à 2005 quand j'ai travaillé à l'Université d'Ottawa dans le département de géographie. Et puis, après un bout de temps, j'étais invitée pas invitée. That's when my French starts to fail me, is when I'm starting to do things too ad-lib. At the end, I'd be happy to answer any questions in French, but when I got recruited to go to the University of Manitoba, it was really to be able to move closer to family, and it also came with the research chair, so it was so much better. So what I'm going to be talking to you about this evening is about, well, this was the title that was actually kind of listed in the program. It wasn't necessarily the title that I would have picked, but never one to walk away from a challenge. I decided, okay, what can I offer as insights into this topic? And I was only given about 25 minutes, so I'm not going to be able to get into this terribly deeply. But if we start to break apart some of the words, what is meaningful? It's a very vague concept, and it's used and interpreted differently both by individuals and also within society. Now, Sherry Arnstein, back in the late 50s, talked about a a ladder of participation that involved 8 rungs, that went from basically non-participation to levels of tokenism, to areas where people would actually have power and control over the process and really be engaged in that decision-making. Now, in an idealized world, we might try to achieve this engagement through such processes such as shared power and control. And the theory within this is that decisions that would be arrived from more meaningful engagement would result in greater accountability, potentially contributing to greater acceptance of those decisions and ultimately easier implementation. But when we talk about meaningful, we also need to talk about who's involved in this process. When we start to think through these issues, we deal with these disparate groups that get lumped into their categorical labels. And Teresa Garvin in 2001 spent a bit of time kind of deconstructing and critically examining that notion of the categories that we attach for scientists, policymakers, and the public. Because ultimately, who are these individuals and how is it that they get fit into these categories? And ultimately, what we see is, despite the fact that we label individuals by the hats that they might wear, we fail to recognize how those hats get interchanged on a minute-to-minute and daily basis. And in fact, what we really need to be looking at in terms of these epistemological distances is really how much closer that those boundaries are, and that there's much more blurring than we would actually like to see, at least when we tend to do our research where we want to have things to fit into nice, neat boxes. So why do we try to engage the public? Well, as this quote kind of depicts, you don't want to treat people like they're mushrooms. This gentleman was one of my, when I was traveling around Ontario talking to people about drinking water following Walkerton, this quote always stayed with me. And the reason we want to engage with members of the public, it was captured really nicely in an editorial in Science in 1998, when Sklobe argued 6 main points for why we should engage citizens in science policy decisions. Number 1, all citizens support science through their tax dollars, and they experience the profound consequences of science, both good and bad. In a democracy, those who experience the consequences of an activity and those who pay for it ordinarily expect a voice in decisions. This is certainly true of any child in any household from once they reach the point of 2, and I don't know if it'll ever stop. Number 3, scientific leaders have no monopoly on expertise, nor do they have a privileged ethical standpoint for evaluating the social consequences of science and of science policies. Number 4, non-scientists already do contribute to science and science policy, and some of the examples that was offered in there was around women's organizations redirecting medical research to reduce gender biases. If you want to kind of flash that forward to even Canadian Institutes of Health Research is trying to encourage more strategies for patient-oriented research in actually engaging them within the kind of research that happens. Number 5, elite-only approaches are antithetical to the open, vigorous, and creative public debate on which democracy, public policy, and science all thrive. And number 6, there is a danger that public support for science will erode if other perspectives are excluded. So that's why we should engage, or try to engage, the public. And we also know what happens when we don't actually incorporate effective strategies. Whether you agree with the decision or not, when patients with multiple sclerosis in Canada agitated quite strongly through the media, not only in terms of how the media covered the issue, but also how they were featured within a lot of those stories, it turned things around in terms of funding clinical trials in a hypothesis that probably under normal standard protocols of science would never have been funded if it were not for that agitation. And so these are the kinds of real issues that can arise when we don't have meaningful opportunities for people to engage. And when we start getting into some of these issues as well, when you start looking at it from the perspective of key informants who might be on the side of trying to engage with the public, the issue always becomes, well, who is the public and how are you actually going to identify them beyond that token individual that you can say, I consulted with the public because I talked to my neighbor down the street. But the issues of also, recognizing that people have very busy lives. They only participate in something that directly affects them, and even then, not always. And some of the challenges of the high costs of trying to mount some of these traveling road shows that might take place in order to try to engage and involve the public. Likewise, when we were talking to citizen volunteers in different capacities in Edmonton and Winnipeg, a lot of them ultimately talked about the fact that a lot of engagement is really sharing decisions that have already been made, and that these people need to be involved before those opportunities for engagement actually happen, because those typically happen at the end. So ultimately, this kind of situation feeds into and contributes to these cycles of apathy and disinterest in agency representatives in wanting to engage people more, and from members of the public trying to even engage. So I'm going to structure my comments over the next 20 minutes around some strategies. I don't have any magic bullet points of if you do this, it will always work. But if you follow a lot of these basic strategies, it'll put you in a right foot forward. Now, my biggest fear is that as I start to unveil these, you're going to think that these are extremely trite. But I hope that over the course of the next few minutes, you'll see where they come from and their roots. You need to treat people with respect. You need to take time to build relationships. We need to actively listen when we actually engage. It's important to share control and power over the process if you want people to have an opportunity to contribute. It's important to interact with people where they're at, not where you think they should be. It's important to clarify terms to make sure that everybody's actually talking about the same thing. And once you think you actually have clarity around what it is we're talking about, clarify it again. Share results of anything that's been learned and explain the decisions that have been ultimately arrived at. Evaluate how well things went so that you can do it better the next time, and repeat. So I'm going to go through these. We start from the principle of we treat people with respect. George Bernard Shaw got it right when he said the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And failure to communicate, or a failure to communicate well, has some very serious consequences. Now, Baruch Bischoff very astutely pointed out that there are significant health and economic consequences associated with communication failures. As a result, one should no more release untested communications than untested pharmaceuticals. Now, you might not think that that actually holds weight, but an untested message can have such substantial implications because it can really take an issue in an entirely different direction. Take time to build relationships and actively listen. 10% of conflict is due to difference in opinion, and 90% is due to delivery and tone of voice. And I would argue that within that 90% is a failure to meet some unstated, often it's an unstated expectation. And often when you're in a circumstance where people are demanding yes or no answers, or things are getting more and more polarized in any kind of engagement, often it's signaling that there's some underlying fundamental value that has not actually been discussed or addressed. Unfortunately, when met with those polarizing situations or those demands for yes or no answers, often the response is to just communicate more of the same, just louder. And when this happens, you end up having blame, frustration, protests, revolts, controversies, problems, and things don't actually get to move forward. So, trying to share control and power over the process. This one's really hard. And it's hard because it's difficult both structurally within and between institutions to share control and power over the process, as well as it is to go from institutions and to different groups of publics. Now, I could have used any number of graphics to try to capture this, but this really captures a lot of the way in which how a lot of risk issues have been dealt with over its history for the last few decades. Typically, risk communication was at the end of a process after science had had an opportunity to do all of its hazard identification, do all of the tests and measurements, and try to assess where are the risks and what are the implications, where then it would fall into the lap of risk managers to make a decision against various policy options that could be available, examining any of the economic, political, and other implications, arrive at a decision, and then ultimately that this would get communicated outwards, and it was very much a one-way transfer. And often it was would be met with conflict and frustration. And ultimately communications, and actually I'd meant to edit that out and put down public engagement, needs a seat at the risk table. Because this is how it often ends up being. You know, it's a major project of utmost importance, but it has no budget, no guidelines, no support staff. It's due in 15 minutes. At last, here's your chance to really impress everybody. And this is often what many people who are trying to do their best to engage, but they're given no budget, they're given no time, they have the best of motivations, but the process and the environment isn't conducive. And we are always fraught with our silos. Everybody loves to sit in the areas that they know very well, but when it starts to cut across, where you have to start interacting between or across those silos, it's where it starts to fall off the rails. And in H1N1, in pandemic H1N1, one of the biggest challenges was in dealing with a controversy that was unfolding. It was highly uncertain. People were making recommendations on the basis of the best available understanding of the circumstance at the time. Public health scientists would be following the surveillance data, trying to make the best decisions around how they would manage vaccine distribution. Shortages in vaccine delivery and in production actually forced to have priority groups being established, and trying to come up with how we would communicate that or how that would actually get disseminated out became very difficult, and we'll get into some of those in a bit. Interact where people are at and not where you think they should be. So this captures some of the kind of good risk communication practices that need to be followed, particularly in terms of the two-way dialogue between experts and agencies, and then to the public to exchange all types of information and knowledge. But despite the definition, there are many concerns that the reality of any kind of changed approach to motivations and practice in communicating with different groups of publics is seriously questioned. Often promoting certain goals, they get usurped by processes designed to support the decisions of technologies that have been deemed desirable by those controlling the message. And there's also serious doubt that conventional risk communication approaches incorporate public values, societal implications, and visions for the future that are really needed in order to have any kind of true engagement on risk. And if knowledge is power, then people actually need to be informed with something. If you can't read the cartoon at the bottom, it says, "Be careful." All you can tell me is be careful. In the risk perception and risk communication community, research and guidance has tended to focus more on trying to improve the message itself. It's done a number of efforts trying to examine the impact of framing, trying to address issues of numeracy. And while we know and we have learned within this research domain the importance of trust over who is actually doing the communication, and despite all of the gains that have been achieved in trying to build the awareness about the importance of trust in the agency or the individuals doing that communication, trying to do it in practice remains difficult to consistently achieve. So clarifying terms. Oftentimes when scientists and researchers are trying to communicate with people outside of their area of expertise, they try to use terms and ways of framing the issue or discussing the issue in a way that is supposed to be helpful, but it never actually gets anywhere productive. Words get thrown around that not everybody interprets the same way, and often things will be discussed of, well, it won't be really a big issue unless maybe the shoes under the bed happen to be blue and pink elephants are flying that day, which is when we would expect the real catastrophic event to occur. But you know, the chances of pink elephants flying are really not going to happen. Therefore, there's nothing to worry about. Those kinds of things really create issues that are rife for controversies. And so when we start getting into the comments about language needs to be accessible, and again for those at the back, the cartoon at the bottom says, but this is the simplified version for the general public. Part of the issues lies not just with the agencies, the scientists, or the public health people trying to talk to the general public, but also for different groups with specialized sets of knowledge trying to work together, trying to achieve a common goal. Sometimes we can't even talk amongst ourselves well enough or clearly enough to be able to advance an agenda that will actually benefit the people that it's trying to serve in the end. And this tension came up a lot during H1N1, particularly when communications people were trying to discuss how they would communicate to the public what it was the public health scientists had determined would be the best course of action. And you know, we were looking for something crisp and clean that people can understand, and they're nuancing. The they there is the public health scientists. They kept adding more and more caveats. And we had quite a bit of pushback from the media. "You guys need to get over yourselves," one reporter said. "We just want to know if we're going to die." And the qualifiers that we were putting in the language was really frustrating people. Now, for anybody who's done research anybody who's done community-based research or anybody who has spent time doing work with First Nations and Inuit and Métis communities, it's really important to actually share the results of any kind of interaction before you even go to publish. And often that is done in order to make sure that you've understood things as they were intended, as well as to contextualize things in a way to make sure that the community that maybe is being engaged understands how it's going to be used beyond certain boundaries, but also having a role or having some of that power in saying, you can talk about these results, but those other ones, I think we would prefer to use them for internal purposes only. And sometimes that happens because people don't want to be further stigmatized. They don't want to be further discriminated against because of how we tend to present things in research. Typically, it's often focused on the negative scenario and all of the horrible things that are going bad, as opposed to identifying those strengths or those aspects that are actually working quite well, and how could we build more on those as opposed to always focusing on the things that have gone poorly. And the reason we need to share results is that people want to be able to walk away from a process feeling that even if I didn't get my way, that at least I had the opportunity to be heard and that it was done fairly. And we can agree to disagree and move on. But some of my stuff is in there, maybe not everything I wanted. But I think if people feel that they are participating in a process that is fair, that is legitimate, that allows for opportunities to be heard, even if not everything that is contributed is used, but they can see how that time that they spent is actually been brought into the process and actually into the decision, that's when you start moving towards meaningful engagement. So why is it so hard to share results? Well, to say that it's difficult is an understatement. And within H1N1, it was one of those opportunities where we introduced an entirely new lexicon within public discourse. There was talk about, it wasn't just the flu, it was pandemic flu. But it wasn't hitting all the people that normally get serious consequences from the flu. It was actually affecting younger people. Oh, and you know, one of the ways in which Canada is going to handle this as a risk management issue is that we're going to make sure that there's enough vaccine for every Canadian who wants it or needs it. But we're not going to actually manage the expectations of what that policy decision would be, because at the time that the decision was made, it was not known or foreseen how difficult it would be to actually ramp up production of an adjuvanted form of a vaccine. Now let's start throwing in new words that have never been discussed before, like adjuvanted, a non-adjuvanted vaccine, and the fact that not your standard age groups are the ones that are being prioritized. It's not seniors that are to be first in line, it's actually going to be younger people. And let's throw pregnant women into the mix. Let's make it even more complicated, because we want to make sure that everybody gets the adjuvanted form because it's supposed to help add that extra booster to make it more effective. But because we lack the safety data, we're going to make sure that for pregnant women there's going to be the unadjuvanted form of the vaccine. Oh, but it's not actually going to be ready at the same time as the adjuvanted vaccine. It's going to be about 3 to 4 weeks later. But unfortunately, because in that intervening period of time, there have been some serious consequences that and harms that pregnant women have faced, we're now going to start telling pregnant women they should get the adjuvanted form of the vaccine, even though all the way along we haven't said to, and so there was huge confusion. People really just wanted to know what to do. And a colleague of mine did focus groups with pregnant women, and in some of those focus groups, women were almost at a point of fisticuffs. Of how dare you harm your child. And on one side it was saying, why aren't you getting the vaccine, you're putting your baby at risk. To women on the other side saying, you're putting your baby at risk because you're getting a vaccine. So there was a huge issues and problems for it. And as a pregnant woman myself at the time, I was quite glad that my baby was born before the vaccine came out and I didn't have to make that decision. And I actually had opportunities to talk to people that I really trusted and who I respected their opinion and trying to go, but it was a very, very confusing time. So is there a role for transparency in terms of how we try to discuss decisions and explain results? Unlike fishbowl transparency, which is a term created by Coglianese in 2009 to discuss this, this process of if governments want to try to show that they're not hiding anything, if decision makers want to show that there's nothing to hide, we're going to make everything available. It's going to be data information overload. It's a massive data dump. The answer is out there if you actually can find it. But you're going to be buried under pages and pages. And in fact, in the words of one participant in my colleague's research project of giant mine remediation of a former gold mining site with the Yellowknives Denning, one of the participants said, you know, one of the biggest obstacles is not the legibility of the materials available, but rather the sheer weight of them. Tens of thousands of pages, and the intimidation factor of 10 gazillion. It was a nightmarish wall of text instead of a pyramid-shaped provision of information that lets people get deeper into it bit by bit, if they're so inclined. So how do we move from something like fishbowl transparency, where you have situations like this, into something that might more resemble that, or a process called reasoned transparency, what Coglianese says is a process that demands that regulators offer explicit explanations for their actions. Sound explanations will be based on application of normative principles to the facts and evidence accumulated by decision makers, and will show why other alternative courses of action were rejected. So reasoned transparency demands that regulators offer explicit reasons for why scientific opinions and decisions and regulatory activities have been arrived at the way they have, such as why particular drugs are approved or why a GMO might be safe for consumption or not. And I mean, I'd be happy to entertain it in questions, but you know, in one of the projects that I did with Melissa Browers in trying to look at uncertainty in policy decision-making around cancer control scenarios, one of the things that we developed was supposed to be this tool that would help you navigate uncertainty or help different groups try to navigate uncertainty, particularly in a way of if you want to be able to communicate why maybe there are some, you know, maybe the decision isn't moving the way some people might like because, well, maybe we better wait for better data, or, well, maybe we might know that the answer, even if we did another randomized control trial, the answer still wouldn't be found. And do we want to be investing that much more money when we're not even going to be able to move that meter of certainty considerable enough to actually decide what might be the best way to proceed? Despite our efforts, it still has kind of fallen on deaf ears. Of course, that's probably because we approached it like left-brained rational actor researchers and trying to see a way of solving a problem. But the unintended consequences that happen when decisions are not explained are serious. Nationally, when priority groups were being established and recognized, of course, health is that wonderful jurisdiction that is shared. You have federal authorities that make certain provisions, but it's up to the provinces to decide what to do. The Public Health Agency of Canada tried to prioritize or make recommendations around priority on the basis of geography. So if people were living in remote communities, maybe they should be prioritized to receive a vaccine because the consequences in such communities could be more serious. In Manitoba, people of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis ancestry were prioritized to receive the vaccine first, along with other priority groups such as people with certain comorbidities and certain health problems and certain age groups. And the way in which a lot of Métis and First Nations people understood this was that the vaccine was actually going to be tested on them to make sure it was safe before it would be given to the white guys. And this kind of sentiment was not just said in one focus group or two or three, it was in all of them. And for all the instances where there was this sense of a conspiracy that this was how Canada was finally going to get rid of itself of the Aboriginal problem, there were also those that were very concerned. They had seen the impact of what happened in northern Manitoba, where one of the communities had been seriously hard hit by H1N1. So people were worried and they were afraid. When they had a relationship with a doctor that they could trust, if their doctor recommended that they get the vaccine, they were more likely to go ahead and do it than if they didn't have that kind of relationship. But the problem that comes down to it is that because of a situation of long-standing distrust, there were concerns of there was no evidence that was actually shown that there was any kind of predisposition towards more adverse consequences of H1N1 if you were somebody of Aboriginal ancestry. And people were really quite critical of some of the recommendations that were coming forward. And when I spoke to people who, and in Manitoba we had different kinds of tables. There was an equity table as well as a section on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis trying to make decisions or try to arrive at public health decisions that would be equitable and meet social justice criteria. Afterwards they said, you know, in hindsight, I'm not surprised that people had that reaction. I thought we had done a good job of communicating it, but obviously we didn't. When you start thinking about how it was hyped up in the media and how the vaccine wasn't sufficiently tested and people were worried and people were afraid, and then when you think about the fact that First Nations and Métis people have never been put first in line to receive anything good before, the reaction was kind of understandable. So when we're dealing with issues of uncertainty, it's really important in the presentation of that uncertainty to be clear. And because I see that some people in the back might not be able to read that, it says fewer in 1 in 10,000. Something like 1 in 14,000 gets these side effects. Hardly anybody gets these side effects. They're extremely rare. You should be very proud. When we start talking about terms and using things to try to get past numeracy issues, and by using labels that might be easier for people to comprehend, it doesn't necessarily serve the goal that it's trying to. And so we have to remember, in any kind of circumstance when we're dealing with interpretation, people use more than facts and evidence to make their decisions. In a social context, we have our prior experiences, our interactions with the beliefs of others, and the fundamental principle that we're not all left-brained rational actors weighing pros and cons. We have feelings, we have emotions, and a huge capacity for processing content in a way that makes sense to us. And this doesn't always have to match what risk assessors, risk managers, or even risk communicators try to recommend. So the thing to try to remember when you're trying to engage public audiences in a meaningful way is to remember that one size doesn't fit all. And of course, we all know this, that everything needs to be tailored and to the appropriate audience, but you also have to have some fundamental understanding of who your audience is and what are going to be the kinds of strategies that will work most effectively for that particular audience. And recognize that in some of the strategies that you might adapt to try to, or adopt to try to engage people, is to remember that other people that fall into a different demographic, those strategies might not work for them. One of the biggest challenges with a lot of information being available online is that it works for those that are quite comfortable with navigating that medium, but for a number of individuals in an aging society, it puts them at a double deficit situation in terms of being able to access that kind of information. So we have to try to be mindful of our audience and making sure that we cover our bases when we're dealing with different groups. And ultimately, in the end, we have to evaluate what works. The only way we get better is to learn. And so for those who might not be able to read at the back, then we've agreed that all of the evidence isn't in, and that even if all the evidence were in, it still wouldn't be definitive. If we embrace evaluation as a process to learn from what we've done in order to do it better the next time, and where if we identify things that maybe it didn't work quite as well as we would have wanted, that we're explicit in that identification, and these are the steps that we're going to try to do to make sure it doesn't happen again. If those things are part and parcel of evaluation, and that evaluation is publicly available, it's not something that gets done and then hidden, then it helps to start creating a culture of learning and growth. And ultimately, we have to recognize that we're all in this together as members of civil society. Mistakes are going to happen. But as I tell my kids all the time, mistakes are just so that we have a chance to learn, and life is always prepared to give us more opportunities to learn those lessons until the lessons actually take. So if we go back to how I started in terms of strategies for meaningful engagement, I haven't told you anything that you don't already know. But just because it isn't things that you don't already know doesn't mean that these are things that we actually do. It might be how you conduct yourself in a day-to-day manner, but it's not how things happen within civil society. So how do you meaningfully engage public audiences? In the words of Yoda, you do. You just do. So I've engaged in this program of research since about 1998, and ultimately the kind of work that I've tried to do has been with the aim of finding that little bit of wiggle room between the proverbial rock and a hard place, even if it means going back to lessons that we all learned back when we were in kindergarten. So I'm going to thank you for your attention, and I will open the floor to any questions.